I have known Bob Mueller for 30 years. We worked closely together throughout my previous tenure at the Department of Justice. We've been friends since, and I have the utmost respect for Bob and his distinguished record of public service. And when he was named special counsel, I said his selection was good news, and that knowing him, I had confidence he would handle the matter properly, and I still have that confidence today. Given his public actions to date, I expect that the special counsel is well along in his investigation. At the same time, the president has been steadfast that he was not involved in any collusion with Russian attempts to interfere in the election. I believe it is in the best interest of everyone, the president, Congress, and the American people, that this matter be resolved by allowing the special counsel to complete his work.
But there were several other times during yesterday's confirmation hearing when the president's nominee for Attorney General, William Barr, avoided making commitments about how he would conduct himself related to the Mueller investigation and the president's conduct.
Will you commit to make public all of the report's conclusions, the Mueller report, even if some of the evidence supporting those conclusions can't be made public?
You know, that certainly is my goal and intent.
Will you commit that you will explain to us any changes or deletions that you make to the special counsel report that's submitted to you in whatever you present to us?
I will commit to providing as much information as I can consistent with the regulations.
You said that a president deliberately impairing the integrity or availability of evidence would be an instruction. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And so what if a president told a witness not to cooperate with an investigation or hinted at a pardon?
You know, I'd have to know the specific. I'd have to know the specific facts.
Okay.
Would it be appropriate to go against the advice of career ethics officials that have recommended recusal? And can you give an example of under what situation or scenario you would go against their recommendation that you recuse yourself?
Well, there are different kinds of recusals. Some are mandated, for example, if you have a financial interest, but there are others that are judgment calls. And
let's imagine it's a judgment call, and the judgment by the career ethics officials in the agency are that you recuse yourself. Under what scenario would you not follow their recommendation?
If I disagreed with it.
And what would the basis of that disagreement be?
I came to a different judgment.
On what basis?
The facts.
Such as?
Such as whatever facts are relevant to the recusal.
Under what scenario would you imagine that you would not follow the recommendation of the career ethics officials in the Department of Justice to recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation?
If I disagreed with them.
Okay.
All right. Not getting anywhere there. Matt, what was your overall take of Mr. Barr's first day?
You know, in some ways, he is an obvious choice for Attorney General. He's obviously very well qualified. He knows the department. He knows its traditions. And he came in and said a lot of the right words that you expect to hear from an Attorney General nominee. But then there are some real concerns about him, and you highlighted them well. I think the first concern is when he talked about the end of the Mueller investigation, whether there is to be a report. We still don't know, of course, whether there will be a report. But if there is one, you know, he talked about it at other times in the hearing, like a declination or a prosecution memo, which are these memos that the department prosecutors write and send up the chain if they decide not to indict someone or they decide to bring an indictment. And those, of course, are always confidential. They're never released publicly. The difference here is that under the department's own rules, the president can't be indicted. So we're not in a normal scenario. So it's hard to see how that kind of, you know, that scenario that he outlined where those documents remain confidential is the applicable one here. And that's why Democrats push for more transparency. His answers would be, I think his answers would still be somewhat acceptable, though, if it wasn't for this memo he'd written. And the memo gives you real concern, not just that he wrote the memo, not just that he expressed those aggressive views about executive power, but that he gave it to Bob Mueller's boss. He gave it to another official at DOJ who would become Bob Mueller's boss if Rod Rosenstein had been fired. And then he gave it to the president's inside counsel in the White House, his outside attorneys, to Mike Pence's attorney, to Jared Kushner's attorney. He was sort of sharing it with all the president's men and discussing it with all of them. And that raises questions about his impartiality that I don't think he went far enough to address. And the tell is that answer, that exchange with Kamala Harris, where he not only refuses to recuse himself, but won't commit to deferring to the advice of people we know are impartial. And that is such a break with precedent, because previous attorney generals of both parties, Jeff Sessions, Eric Holder, Deputy Attorneys General Rod Rosenstein, Sal Yates, all committed not just to seek the advice of ethics officials, but to follow it. And I think it's a real tell about what his intentions are that he wouldn't make that same commitment.
It's also a real tell that he wouldn't even say. There was another way he could have said it, which is, well, of course, I will certainly grant a great deal of deference to ethics officials that have come down, that have made a decision suggesting that maybe I should not be involved in it. And there would have to be a very compelling reason for me to ignore them. He didn't do that. He just said, I'll do what I want to do. If I disagree with it, I'll disagree with it. One other thing, too, I understand that it has been the guidelines of the Justice Department for some time that a sitting president cannot be indicted. But again, as you're suggesting, in this case, when you have an act, when you have a possibly illegal act that is the subject of the possible indictment, and that illegal act could be argued, that illegal act helped elect that president of the United States, then suggesting that a president of the United States cannot be indicted in all cases, that suddenly becomes a guideline that is meaningless, because it was the illegal act that could have possibly caused the election of the president.
Yeah, I think that's right. Look, I think that opinion by the Department's Office of Legal Counsel is suspect. I'm not sure it would hold up in the courts, but I also think it's somewhat of an academic debate, because I don't see the Department overturning its opinion, and they're, of course, the ones that get to decide whether to bring charges or not. But it's an important conversation to have, because if the president can't be indicted, for that opinion to not be a farce, for the president to not be above the rule of law at all, it means that at the end of a department's investigation, if they find any evidence that the president committed a crime, or that that it may not be a crime, but it's a violation of his oath of office, which is something Barr indicated yesterday that a president trying to end an investigation, that impact on him would be, then it's incumbent upon the department to turn that evidence over to the body that is responsible for holding him accountable. That would be Congress. And we know, he has obviously criminal exposure in the Mueller probe, but there's actual evidence of criminality in the Southern District of New York probe. In that case, we know the Justice Department has essentially concluded he committed a crime. So there is a real question at the end of both of those probes, what happens? And I would have liked to have heard from Barr that, maybe we won't make that evidence public, but if we find evidence that the president committed a crime or that he violated his oath of office, we'll make it available to Congress.
And again, committed a crime possibly in the final weeks of the campaign to help get elected president of the United States. Mike Barnicle, you talk about farce. You have Trumpists right now who are writing opinion pages, people formerly respectable conservatives, who are now demanding that Robert Mueller have more transparency and he release information for the American people to read in the middle of his investigation, which they know is pure sophistry. They know is something that he's never going to do. And yet here we have Mr. Barr, who I believe did well yesterday, but we have Mr. Barr suggesting he may not even be transparent with Congress or the American people with the final report, which I must say, in an otherwise strong job on Capitol Hill yesterday, that's something that really causes me grave concern, that they would not even allow, he would not even allow as Attorney General, Robert Mueller, to be transparent with the American people.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, Mr. Barr had a pretty good day yesterday in front of the United States Senate. He answered questions, specifically he answered questions that gave some relief to people who felt that he would perhaps interfere with Bob Mueller. He cleared that up. But there were two flags, as Matt just mentioned, as you have alluded to. One is his reluctance to agree to recusal. And the other is his reluctance to agree to release the complete Mueller report. And John Meacham, one of the interesting things about his testimony, I think to many people, was that it came as such a relief, I think, to a lot of people, given what's happened to the Justice Department. We have had a series of premeditated attacks on one of the most vital institutions of our country, Department of Justice and the FBI, and I think people are saying, wow, this is great. Now we have a guy who's not going to, ruin the department more than it's already been ruined.
Yeah. Well, he's been Attorney General. Right?
Yeah.
So it's been 25 years, 27 years. Richard Thornburg went to run for the Senate against Harris Wofford in 91, and Barr took over at the end of the first Bush administration. Yes, I mean, I think that and Joe knows this well, in the taxonomy of conservatism, Barr's of a particular type, sort of a Federalist. I suspect he's in the Federalist Society, but clearly a very conservative Washington lawyer. He looks like an attorney general because he was an attorney general. And at this point in Trump's Washington, that goes for a lot. At least it's not Judge Pirro.
Matt Whitaker.
Or the one who's in office, yeah.
Jeff
sorry.
Sessions.
Yeah, well, again, Donald Trump's the only guy who can make Jeff Sessions look like Oliver Wendell Holmes, but he may have done. I think it's fascinating because all of these tributaries are going to come rolling into the same place. Russia, Mueller, stuff we don't even know about, the campaign stuff. And I think it's a fascinating moment about presidential power. I understand the basic idea that you can't indict a president because the idea is that they would just become a political target and it would just be constant. But, is someone really above the law? I mean, are you saying you can't indict and at least wait until after he's gone out of office to try him? The founders basically wanted to trust to the impeachment process. They wanted to make it difficult. They didn't want a parliamentary system. That's why treason's very hard to prove. Bribery's a little easier. High crimes and misdemeanors is the easiest because it's undefined. But sort of in the same way we were just talking about, sometimes people think, oh God, does it really matter who my congressman is? Does it really matter as senator? Because it's all, the boat goes on anyway. Yeah, it does matter for moments exactly like this.
So Matt Miller, if you are an American watching at home, you don't know Bill Barr, you don't know his history really, you're watching, and he says he will protect the Mueller investigation. He believes it should go on. He said we'll make the results of that investigation public. He says he does not believe it's a witch hunt when he's asked. He tells Lindsey Graham, I think Jeff Sessions did the right thing recusing himself, going against what President Trump has said. As John says, he's been Attorney General. By the way, he was confirmed by a unanimous voice vote in a Democratic Senate in 1991. This looks like a conventional Republican choice to become Attorney General. So I guess what the senators in the room have to weigh, and there are 53 Republicans and 47 who vote Democratic, so it would be a surprise if he weren't confirmed, I think. They have to weigh whether the man they saw in the room yesterday is the real Bill Barr, or the man they saw in that 20-page memo that he put out in June is the real Bill Barr.
It is a very hard question to answer because Barr has basically made the decision to rest on whether you trust him or not. Yeah. That's what it comes down to. He's saying, I'm not going to defer to impartial ethics officials whose judgment we have no reason to question. You have to trust me to do the right thing. And there are reasons to question his judgment. There are also reasons to think he would perform admirably in office. Yeah. His record is a little mixed. I will say one of the things that I found encouraging about that he said yesterday, he was asked, would it be, is it unethical? Is it the wrong thing for a president to do to interfere with a probe at the Department of Justice? And he said it would be a violation of his oath of office.
Right.
We know the president has done that on a number of occasions with respect to the Mike Flynn investigation, with respect to the Southern District of New York investigation, where he asked the acting Attorney General Matt Whitaker why more wasn't being done to control the investigation into him, his kids, his personal business. That was a really important answer, and I think that sets the stage, if we find factual evidence that that's what the president did, for something to be done about it. He said the same thing about if the president were to offer a pardon in exchange for a witness's silence, that would be a crime. Those are important things. We have to see now how he applies those facts, and the question is, do you trust him or not? Hard to answer.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.